Welcome to our 2019 Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture, A Life in Public Service with John Koskinen. I'm Judith Kelly, Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy, and the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture is endowed by the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust in honor of the late Terry Sanford. And we would like to welcome Tom Keenan and Doug Zinn from the Keenan Charitable Trust. I'm going to have to go home and try to learn how to say charitable trust. Terry Sanford, as you all know, was a much beloved governor of North Carolina, president of Duke University, and a public servant in many other ways. And he started the Sanford School. And so it's very befitting that the lecturers who come to the Terry Sanford Lecture are people who have lived a life of distinguished service like John has. And we've invited John Koskinen here today because we as a public policy school want to try to shine a light on public service, and what better moment to do that than in the middle of a government shutdown. But it highlights more than ever the importance of a quality government, and John and I were talking this afternoon about how when the government shuts down, we do come to appreciate the value of government and the services it provides us and the many important functions it has. And John has held many different important different types of positions in public service over his career, which is why it's so interesting to have him here as a lecturer tonight, because he can speak to so many different angles of public service. We've counted about 11 different types of positions he's had, and the most famous one that you may be aware of course, is that he served as IRS commissioner. But he also, and probably just as famous, actually presided over the whole Y2K conversion for not just the United States, but really rallied to be for the globe as a whole. And that's the kind of thing that if it goes well, everybody says, so everything was fine, what was the problem? But that we didn't have a problem because of John. Freddie Mac has been another beneficiary of his leadership, and the U.S. Soccer Federation. So you can see the span of things that he has been involved with. He also was responsible for running all city departments in D.C. from 2000 to 2003. And he's been deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget, which is a position he held in the mid-1990s, in 1995, in fact, when we had that very famous government shutdown. And so he has seen from the inside what it takes to actually run a government shutdown. If for those reasons are not enough for you to think that John's name is familiar, of course he is also very beloved around campus and familiar because of the Koskinen Stadium that he and his wife Pat endowed and gifted to the university, and Pat will be joining us shortly. So we want to thank both of them for their generosity towards the university. Following the lecture, which we're going to be live streaming, we're going to have some questions and answers. Hopefully answers, John, I don't know. We'll have questions. And the final act, before we hand it over to John, is to introduce Kristin Goss, who is a professor here at the Sanford School of Public Policy, and also is a director of the Duke in D.C. program that we run here out of the Sanford School. And she has been acknowledged both for her scholarship and for her teaching as a Bass Fellow. So welcome to you as well, Kristin, and thank you for coming down from D.C. from the program that you're running at this very moment right now up there. So thank you, and thank you, John, for coming, and welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and I want to send a special welcome to the Duke and DC students who are watching the live stream. At least I think they are. It's going to be a really special evening. This is the man who signed my diploma when I got my MPP here in 1996 and went on to serve as my husband's boss at one of those agencies. So it's a very, very special evening for me as well. So thank you. So you grew up in Ashland, Kentucky, and you had never laid eyes on Duke before you arrived in 1957. We were talking about how enrolling must have been sort of a leap of faith for you. So why did you decide to come to Duke, and can we take this leap of faith as a harbinger of your career choices going forward?
Good question. First of all, let me say I really am delighted and honored to have been asked to join you here tonight. I have done a lot of different things with Duke, one of which was I was on the Board of Visitors of the policy student when actually the decision was made to build this building. And it was designed for these pods so students could get together and talk. And it never occurred to me at the time that if you were a speaker, all of those people up there could throw spitballs at you or boo or something like that. So we're assuming you're going to be on your good behavior. But that's right. In the old days, I'm a little older than many of you. In the old days, nobody really did college visits. And in fact, the brochures for colleges were just big, thick books that told you the courses. And actually, the one for most of the colleges I looked at didn't even have pictures in them. And so my dad had died before my last year in high school. So I was looking to try to figure out how I could get through college with the least amount of financial outlay. And so I had applied to 9 different schools, running from Harvard to the University of Kentucky. And Duke was on the list because a friend of our family's knew that I was interested in science and physics, and also that I had done a lot of high school debating, was interested in politics, and Duke was a place that had a great physics department and also obviously a great liberal arts school. But the key thing that made the decision, never having been here or anywhere else other than the University of Kentucky, was that Duke was the only place that would allow you, if you had a Duke scholarship, and I had a national scholarship from Duke, would allow you to keep all the other scholarships that you got. And I had a National Elks Club scholarship and a whole set of miscellaneous things. So for me, it was first attractive because of the combination of physics and liberal arts, and also because in those days, I think tuition had just gone up to $650 a year. Students were grown. It meant that I could come here really without burdening my mother at that time. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. It was a great experience. It was a wonderful place. It was a great physics department. 2/3 of the way through, when I started, this was the era of Sputnik. The Russians had put up Sputnik, and everybody thought, well, the obligation was we should all become scientists and fight the Russians. So in my class, at the start of my freshman year, there were 25 physics majors. At the end of the year, there were 5 physics majors. And others had figured out maybe there was a better way to spend their time. By my junior year, I went to drop by the room of one of my fellow physics majors, and he had a big blackboard with the equations on it and Scientific American on the bureau. And I thought, gee, I don't own a blackboard, and I don't subscribe to Scientific American. Maybe that's a signal that physics isn't where I'm going to spend my time. And so as I used to tell people, I decided that people were more interesting than electrons. And so I was one of the few physics majors to apply to law school at Harvard or Yale. I had actually gotten into Harvard. I had won a National Merit Scholarships had just started. And so I won a National Merit Scholarship, but Harvard decided that they would, it was an early day and nobody quite knew how to fix this, that I could go to Harvard with a scholarship of $100 a year. So my mother was very irrepressible, called both the head of the Merit Scholarships and Harvard, saying, how can that make any sense? So I ended up at Duke. So when I applied to law schools, I applied to Harvard and Yale, and was one of the few people who turned down Harvard, and I was delighted to be able to do that and go to Yale. And they asked me, how could you do that? And so I couldn't resist telling them, well, you know, a long time ago. So anyway, I came here, and it was wonderful, and I've been a Dookie ever since.
Right. So after you...
But the question is, okay, was that leap of faith consistent with everything I've done? I do have, as you've heard, and you haven't heard the half of it, this checkered employment career. Where I've gone from one thing to another. The only consistency in it is most of the places I've been are organizations in difficulty of one kind or another. So there is an element of that anytime I take these jobs, one of them I took was I managed the bulk of the assets of the Teamsters pension fund just after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. And a friend of mine asked, why would you take that job? And I said, well, if nothing else, it'll be interesting cocktail party conversation. And he said, it will be, even after you're gone. So I have taken a lot of jobs not knowing exactly what they were going to be like. The Y2K was one of them. The president asked me to come back, and as I tell people, gave me an office and an assistant and said, "Don't let the world stop," and that was the last I saw of him. So it has been a sort of set of leaps of faith.
Yeah, right. So after graduating from law school, as you've sort of alluded to, you spent 21 years managing large, troubled, potentially bankrupt corporations, and then you spent the next 23 years managing challenges in the nonprofit sector and the public sector. And I'm curious what is similar and what's different about managing challenges in those two different arenas.
I get asked that often. I got asked that a lot when I first went to OMB after 20 years in the private sector. And as I've told people, one way to look at it, obviously the private sector has a bottom line that everybody talks about, and so your performance can get more easily measured. And in the government, it's a little harder to know exactly what the right performance measures are. And people sometimes think that makes the private sector more efficient or effective. But as I've said, another significant difference, in the private sector, you have to do something pretty extraordinary wrong to get on the front page of a national newspaper. In the public sector, it doesn't take much before everybody wants to know who was that person and are they going to get fired, and you get congressional hearings and the rest of it. So the pressure and the visibility in the public sector is a lot more apparent than in the private sector. But having spent kind of half my career in both places, I've told people there really aren't significant differences. It's really, you're dealing with employees. You're trying to hire the right people. You're trying to train them. You're trying to give them the right support, the right structure, the right leadership to achieve the mission of whatever the organization is. And my experience has been that the management and leadership challenges you face in, whether it's in a big corporation in trouble or in a major federal agency trying to deal with a situation, are pretty much the same. And the management experience you bring and whatever skill you might have accumulated applies in both places equally well.
Right. So the next question is an especially timely one. You ran, as you mentioned, the first real, or managed the first real shutdown of the federal government in 1995 when you were deputy director of OMB. I'm curious what happens behind the scenes when the government is shutting down, when it is shut down, that maybe the American public and perhaps even members of Congress don't appreciate. And what can we learn from the experience in 1995 that might get us out of this mess that we're in today? Also, if you can get the government reopened.
Well, I'm sorry to report that my record of having run the longest shutdown in history has now gone by the boards. Since we're in, I don't know, day 24 or 25. And the only one of my erroneous predictions was after the two shutdowns, actually. There was a 5-day shutdown in November and then the 21 days from December into early January. I predicted at the end of that, because it had gone so badly for those pushing for it, particularly the Republicans, that nobody would ever do it again. It was clearly, I think, the lesson I thought everybody had learned was it's a terrible way to run an organization. That is, just shut it down and just see if anybody notices. And so I thought they'd never do it again, only to be somewhat dismayed or surprised in 2013 when they tried it again, and this time around. And so in '95, the government previously for years had never really been shut down. And so the agency did not have shutdown plans. So in the summer of 1995, group historian here, the Republicans had taken control of the House with 55 new congressmen in the election, midterm election in '94. And by the summer of '95, it was fairly clear, of all things, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans were pushing a balanced budget amendment. And I keep wondering what happened to the Republicans who used to worry about balanced budgets, since we're going to have $1 trillion deficit this year. But in any event, it was a question of what would happen with entitlements and how the budget would, whether there was going to be a plan to be balanced or not, and a lot of argument back and forth. So in the summer, it was clear we did not want to send a signal that we were encouraging a shutdown or wanted to have one. On the other hand, you couldn't wait until the last minute and then try to figure out who was an emergency essential employee and who wasn't. So we, in the summer, formed what we called the Fall Working Group to pull the agencies together and have them draft, for the first time, real shutdown plans. And everybody was referring to it as a train wreck that was about to happen. And my wife, Pat, had been teaching at Gallaudet for a semester. She was an educator, taught mostly at Maryland. And so I said, okay, what's the sign language for train wreck? So the sign language for train wreck is tracks, so that's train wreck. So we would meet at the fall working group. And so everybody knew what we were about. So my sense was, and nobody disagreed really, was you had to play it straight. The Anti-Deficiency Act, the criminal statute, is very clear that if you don't have the money, you can't spend it, and if you don't have the money, you cannot encourage an obligation to spend it. So the exceptions are protection of life or property, or anybody who's got money. So I said, you know, the issue isn't, and we're going to get cross-examined afterwards, is this a program we like, or are these people we care about or don't care about, or are we trying to make a statement? You have to play it straight and decide what's necessary to protect life and property, and otherwise it may be inconvenient or unfortunate for people where we're not going to be able to do it. And to get 2 million employees all on, and their agencies all on the same page, took some doing. And even then, we ran the first 5 days, and if you had money, you could run. And there's a rule then in the Defense Department that the defense production plants run by the private sector could only run if there was a Defense Department employee on the line. So they had enough money, surplus funds, to run for the first week. So at the end of the first week on a Friday, I got a call from Judy Miller, the Chief Counsel of Defense, saying, well, we're out of money. And I said, okay, you get to shut the plants down. So we shut down 42 defense production plants, including one in Kansas that Senator Dole was unhappy about. So they opened the government on Monday, funded the Defense Department, argued for a little while, and then shut the whole place down. Partially, I think, because I used to maintain anyway, that some of the 55, if not all of the 55 new members of Congress thought the government was primarily foreign aid and welfare. And if you shut it down, who would care? Because that's about all they knew about the government. So for the second shutdown, we spent some time putting out daily news flashes of the number of SBA loans not being given, the number of FHA mortgages not being given, the number of visits to public parks not taken, the number of museums visits that were no longer taken. And over time, the public noticed that a lot of things they took for granted were actually provided by the federal government, and they were things that they thought were important or valuable or that they wanted to be involved with. Which is why at the end of it all, the consensus was that it had been a bad idea, the Republicans were blamed for it, and it would never happen again. But even in the middle of it, you had to make continual decisions about had what was a non-emergency become an emergency. For example, Social Security used to make all of its payments on the first of the month before they shifted to paying on birth dates. So the first shutdown was not around the first of the month, so we shut Social Security down. But by the time you got to the second shutdown, you had to open it up again because you were getting ready to make the monthly payments. So I spent a lot of time with the Chief Counsel at OMB and the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice as people would get asked questions. Cabinet secretaries and anybody confirmed by the Senate have a permanent appropriation, which is why they all can work. But the decision we had made was nobody who worked for them who didn't have some specific emergency function could show up for work. So we had cabinet secretaries with no secretaries or receptionists, and they would call and want to know, could they do X or could they do Y? Could they make a speech? Could they go to a fundraiser? And so it was a kind of moving target. And so you see some of that going on now, where there are decisions being made, although there are serious questions as to whether some of the decisions being made are being made not because it's an emergency, but the administration has been upfront about it. They're trying to make it less inconvenient or less painful for taxpayers or the public. They're going to pay tax refunds, for instance. So I've been telling reporters who ask me, who have discovered that I ran the first shutdown, that that's not the standard. And I said, if you're worried about inconvenience to people, don't shut the place down. The standard is this an emergency? Is it protecting life or property? And the fact that people aren't going to be happy is not the question, and your goal is not to make them feel better about it. The goal is, in fact, to comply with the statute. But it is a serious problem. The concern a number of us have is that now that you had a shutdown in 2013 and you've got this one around a single issue, do we build a wall, do we not build a wall, do we fund it? The risk is that this gets to be part of the game, and that if you've got an issue, whoever the administration is, whatever the situation of Congress is, and you're trying to make a point or trying to leverage the situation, what you're going to do is say, well, let's not fund that agency, or let's not fund that set of those agencies, or let's not fund the whole thing, and pressure people. And that's obviously a dangerous situation for the government to get into. This should not become business as usual for the efficiency and effectiveness of the government. What people forget is if you're shut down for 25 days and people come back to work, it's not as if that work got done in those 25 days. So you have a huge backlog of papers to be processed, applications. The SEC is not processing a lot of information. FHA is not issuing mortgages. So you've got a lot of work that has to be caught up. And so it really is not, as I said, a good way to run a railroad. Beyond that, and we'll talk, and the whole reason you all are here for today and tomorrow is the impact it has on existing federal employees and people who think of themselves as potentially becoming federal employees. You know, it's been bad enough, the gridlock in Washington for some time now about where is the government hamstrung. But if on top of that, you run the risk as a government employee of not getting paid for, you know, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, how long ever it might be, you might decide maybe there's a better way to spend your time. So it's a, you know, it's not a frivolous enterprise and undertaking. I think this time around, some people supporting it on the administration side thought, well, we funded 2/3 of the government, 1,200,000 employees are working, so the 800,000 furloughed won't make the same impact. But I think as the ripple effects get felt, they're going to understand that this is not beanbag, this is serious. And I think that at some point, there hopefully will be a serious discussion about whether this should ever happen again.
Yeah. I was talking to my cab driver today, and he's worried about how he's going to pay his rent because his fares have declined so dramatically during the shutdown in D.C. So
right. I mean, the narrow focus on, you know, do I care about that agency? People forget about the contractors, the people, they're talking about restaurants and people like that who depend upon people coming in who now are staying home because they don't have funding. 800,000 people is a lot of people.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask you now about your time as Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service when that agency was under especially intense political fire. And I'm wondering what constraints entrepreneurial and seasoned public servants such as yourself find yourself facing in the current political environment. And in particular, did you have any expectations of what you might be able to accomplish at the IRS that you weren't able to fulfill?
Well, my first goal was to get out alive, and that seemed to have worked well. For those not following closely, you may recall this, I got invited in after the Inspector General had reported that the IRS had been holding up and delaying applications from predominantly Tea Party organizations who wanted to be social welfare tax-exempt organizations, and it was viewed as a targeting scandal. And the position by those who control the House and the Senate was this was all dictated by the president or somebody in the Justice Department designed to keep these organizations from being effective in the 2012 presidential election. And so there'd been 6 months of hearings and arguments and contention. Danny Werfel, is Danny here? Danny, I think, may be coming.
He had to go to work.
Pardon?
He had to work.
He had to work. A likely story. Anyway, Danny had been, was over at OMB, got dragooned into being the interim IRS commissioner and took all the incoming for 6 months before I showed up as the next IRS commissioner. So I spent a good part of the 4 years being yelled at by the Freedom Caucus and others. The Freedom Caucus, you may recall, actually decided they'd try to impeach me. So I've lost 2 chances for history. One is my record of running the longest shutdown is now gone. And the only other time in history that anybody not a president has been impeached was 150 years ago, the Secretary of War. So I thought, well, you know, if they impeach me, then, you know, I'll be famous. And whenever anybody talks about it, they say, well, you remember the IRS commissioner. But it didn't work out very well for them. And I think it was 342 to 72, they lost that vote. But in the middle of it all, the IRS budget was in the process of being regularly cut. And everybody said, well, and the Republicans said at my appropriation hearings, well, this is punishment and making sure the IRS runs well in response to the targeting. And if you want to talk about inconvenient facts or fake news, I kept trying to remind people the budget had started being cut in 2010, 3 years before anybody knew who Lois Lerner was, to some extent because the decision was if you couldn't unwind or defeat the Affordable Care Act, which was passed in 2010, you could underfund the implementation of it. And the vast majority of the implementation at the back end is run by the IRS. So the budget was cut every year. The budget now, 8 years later, is about $1 billion less than it was in 2010, even though there are 10 million more taxpayers. The net result is there were 100,000 employees when I started. There are under 80,000 employees now trying to provide the same service to more taxpayers. So the lack of funding, besides any other constraints, was the biggest constraint on being able to make significant progress. The IRS runs an antiquated IT system. I used to delight in telling people it's running programs that were running when John F. Kennedy was president. When I was doing Y2K, we worried about the lack of COBOL programmers. These programs are in assembly language, which predates COBOL. So you have to hire people and train them how to do this, which I said is like hiring somebody to read antique Latin so they could translate one book as you go. So it was a constraint. The question, though, in some ways deals with, well, if you're in the government, what are the constraints on being able to do things you want to do? And my sense is that there are constraints. I mean, the government, the advantage of the government in some ways is that it's responsive to the public. And so you can't just take off on your own and never get asked about it. And so, and it sometimes takes longer to get things, major changes done than you would like. But as a general matter, going back to the difference in the public and the private sector, my sense was that the constraint was not the workforce. The IRS, as I've said many times, was as good a workforce as any workforce I worked with, whether in the 20 years, 21 years in the private sector or in the government. So our biggest constraint, trying to help taxpayers more efficiently deal with the IRS electronically or otherwise, trying to process returns more effectively, the biggest constraint was the lack of funds. And the IRS is not the only agency constrained, but the IRS has been cut more than anybody else. So when President Trump came in and they wanted a proposal for shrinking the workforce, I sent back a note saying we gave it the office. We were already by that time down by 15,000 people, and I thought that was probably about as much as anybody could ask for.
Interesting. So what was your proudest moment serving in government, and what's your biggest regret?
For the public record. Well, probably the most interesting challenge, and in some ways the most fun, was the year 2000. We had started working on the government programs in 1995 when I was the Deputy Director for Management at OMB. So when I first got called and talked with the President about it, my thought was there was a focus on whether the government was going to be ready. Social Security has, at that time, had 52 million lines of code, all of which were custom and all of which had to be checked to make sure the numbers and the dates would function. And Steve Horn, a congressman from California, head of the House Oversight Committee, was putting out report cards every quarter of where the agencies were. And he was predicting Justice would be done in 2012, the Labor Department would be done in 2003. And so that had gotten people's attention, and particularly the Vice President was concerned because he was going to run for president in 2000. And if the place wasn't operating, that would not be good. So I told him, well, I thought the government was in good shape, but I got prevailed upon to come back, and so I did that. And the next thing, people started asking, well, if the government works, what about the critical infrastructure? So we had formed the President's Council on the year 2000 by request, which included all the agencies, and for the first time, all the regulatory agencies, which usually stay apart. So the Federal Reserve, the Federal Communication Commission, the SEC, all were part of the President's Council. So we spent a day early on, and I said, okay, what we need to do is say, where will be the crises if computers stop working? So for 5 minutes, you could name off the easy ones: transportation, finance, telecommunications. But as you started thinking about it, you ended up with healthcare and pharmaceuticals and state and local government and educational facilities. And we ended up with 25 areas. So the next question was, okay, now what do we do about that? And my theory was the only way to deal with it, there were some people who said, well, we should hire a lot of people and computer experts and we'd solve the problem because we're the government. And I said, fortunately, we don't have enough time to do that because it's a terrible idea. So the goal was to create, out of those 25 working groups, put a federal agency in charge of the relevant group. So transportation was in charge of dealing with trains and automobiles and planes, and the Energy Department had oil and gas. And then I had to convince all the industry groups representing the critical infrastructure that they should become partners with us and take responsibility of working with us to, in fact, make sure that their segment of the economy worked. And I had great conversations with these Washington groups that the American Petroleum Institute said, well, we don't do that. You know, we issue papers. We never actually coordinate anything. So we managed to convince them all to do that. And then we convinced them all that what we ought to do is put out quarterly reports about the status of the industry, which they were all concerned about. Well, you know, people will panic when we tell them in the oil and gas industry we're only 35% done. I said, no, they'll believe you because they'll figure if you were going to lie, you would say you were already done. So the fact that you're willing to concede that you've only done a third of it means that as you work your way through it, you'll have credibility. So they all signed on to that, and we're chugging along. And I had gone to the UN, had an informatics working group just to explain what we were doing. And that summer of '98, Ahmad Kamal, the permanent ambassador from Pakistan, who was a computer techie and ran the informatics committee, called me and said, we got to do something to organize the world because the UN refuses to be involved. And I was tempted to say, what do you mean we got to do something? So the next thing you know, I had met a number of Y2K coordinators around the world, so we created a board of directors because I didn't want it to look like it was a US initiative because a lot of people were nervous that we were just trying to have technology companies from the US take over the world. So we had 12 coordinators from Bulgaria and Japan and England around, and we divided the world up by continents, and they all became coordinators for their continents. And so I thought, well, we'll have a meeting at the UN, and if we get 30 or 40 countries, that'll be important and that'll be helpful. And if we get Y2K coordinators there, their countries and the presidents or prime minister will take this seriously because, geez, there's this meeting. So in December of '98, it was fascinating. The UN staff thought we were talking about December of '99 because they never organized anything in 2 or 3 months. And we're excited when we said, no, it's just September. I said, we're going to do it in December, the first week. So we ended up with 100 countries that showed up, all of whom very focused and concerned on this, all of whom wanted to run these continental meetings, and our deal was we'd provide them information from American companies and whatever they wanted, technology. Most of them were worried about telecommunications and finance. So then they all wanted to come back and look at contingency planning. So in June of '99, we had a meeting at the United Nations of 170 countries, which was the largest meeting in the history of the United Nations other than a General Assembly. And it was because we got the Congress, it's a long story, but anyway, to get this to work, you had to get liability limiting legislation because the first thing companies told me is we can't talk to anybody else because our lawyers say we'll either be sued for violating the Antitrust Act, or if we give information to a competitor and it doesn't work, they'll sue us. So that summer, we had to pull together legislation that had to be done by unanimous consent because we didn't have enough time for hearings and the rest of it. Anybody who knows about all this knows that trying to get liability limiting legislation through the Congress in any form, any time, is impossible. One of the Senate staff people told me, he said, you're looking for a miracle. And I said, well, everybody deserves a miracle sometime. So we got it done in the Senate by unanimous consent. But this time the White House got very nervous and they heard about this. And so I had a meeting one Saturday with all the lawyers who were very concerned. And they said, well, what about Ralph Nader and what about the trial lawyers and all these people opposed to liability limiting? I said, well, I know Ralph. I'll talk to Ralph and I'll talk to the Consumers Union. And I met with the executive directors of the American Trial Lawyers Association. And so I told them, I said, look, to defeat this, all you have to do is get one of 435 congressmen to stand up and say, I object. And there's nothing I can do about that. But I will tell you, as I've told the Congress, if you could do one thing to solve this problem, you would free up the flow of information, because that's what's stymieing everybody. And so if you defeat this, and the world does come to an end, and then there's an ex post facto investigation, and they want to figure out what went wrong, sooner or later they'll figure out who it was that stopped the flow of information. So a couple of weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, the consent calendar in the House comes up. It's about the 5th item. We did not call it liability limiting legislation. We had some art form that I've forgotten. And about 20 people in Washington are watching as the clerk says, any objections? And there's a pause, and then he says, passed. And people have asked me what made the difference and how did we actually solve this problem? And it was that pass that did it. Because not only could all the competitors in power and telecommunications exchange information, they could exchange information with their suppliers and the supply chains. And they were then able to run these forums all around the world on telecommunications, finance, ATMs, and the rest of it, so that that information spread all around. So being able to sort of be in the middle of all that was great fun and fascinating. In terms of the biggest disappointment problem, I am usually a happy, cheery guy. You have to be an optimist, as I say, to spend 45 years running disasters. There are 2 deputy commissioners at the IRS, and they're all career people. The only political appointee is the commissioner and the chief counsel. I said the system is designed to run no matter who the idiot is, they appoint as commissioner. So one of the deputy commissioners maintains the only time he saw me aggravated, raise my voice, was the second appropriation where everybody else got money in the government. You know you're in trouble when you're on the front page of the Washington Post as the agency that got the biggest cut. And it was aggravating because we were already now into January. We only had 8 months left to actually find the $350, $400 million that had been cut. We had to think actually about having to shut the place down for 2 days. And it was aggravating because I had spent the previous 15 months trying to convince and explain to the appropriators why it was nonsensical to cut the budget of the revenue arm of the government. At my confirmation hearing, I testified I had spent 20 years in the private sector and nobody ever said, hey, let's starve the revenue arm of the government, of the operation, and just see how it does. And so and I had spent a lot of time, and when they did that, that was probably the nadir. I had predicted in my first appropriation hearing in 2014, I said, if you keep cutting this budget, the taxpayer service is going to get to be terrible. They cut the budget, and that following year, the taxpayer service was abysmal. Only 37% of people could get through on the lines when they called, let alone have to wait for time. So I had another appropriation hearing where they always did one at the end of the filing season where they yelled at me it was all my fault because we had funded and were working on the Affordable Care Act. And I said, no, the Affordable Care Act is a statute and it's a statutory mandate. And the IRS does statutory mandates. So if you cut the budget as you have, we just have to find the money somewhere else, which is discretionary. And audits and taxpayer service are the discretionary areas. So that was the nadir, not being impeached or yelled at. The nadir of those 4 years was confronting the challenge of taking an agency already strapped and trying to figure out, okay, how do we run this place for the next 8 months with even less money than we had before?
Right. And I'm going to conclude with a final question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So some people are concerned that amid the political dysfunction and declining government capacity and declining trust in government, that we're increasingly outsourcing public problem solving to entrepreneurial billionaires and social ventures and so forth in the nonprofit sector. What do you think of this trend, and how might we make government more credible and more appealing to younger generations of Americans who are looking for careers?
Well, it is an interesting trend. It's not unique. I mean, there were the equivalent of billionaires, Carnegie and others at the turn of the century who, were great philanthropists and had particular areas of interest. And I guess my sense is, both for the billionaires and the nonprofits, you can't have too many people trying to solve problems. And so the more people looking at problems in the public sector and problems that would make the country stronger, better, help people, that's all to the good. To the extent that there's a movement in people saying, well, that's the only way to do it, you overlook the capacity of the government that billionaires and philanthropists don't have. First of all, the government is responsive, as I said earlier, in terms of what you can do or not do. So when you're solving problems, it's important to get feedback and figure out whether it's working or not and see how the people feel about that. And so the government can do that. The government also is the only entity that can do it nationally. The federal government, the state and local can do it in their areas. So that no matter what your educational solution or healthcare solution is that you come up with, and no matter what your funding, Bill Gates is doing wonderful things, but you can't institutionalize and create a program that works across the board. Only the government can do that. So in terms of trying to get people to remember and understand that, as I say, to some extent, I've, in '95 anyway, thought that the shutdown was a teachable moment to remind people of the critical things that people take for granted that the government does, that they forget is part of the government. It's the classic in the Tea Party argument about, in 2010, about the Affordable Care Act, where a woman stood up and said, whatever you do, don't touch my Medicare, as if Medicare was some private program as opposed to a significant government program. So I think that the government has a critical and important role to play. It's the only one that can nationally worry about clean air, clean water, can provide protection, can worry about major research initiatives on solving problems, health problems of one kind or another. And so the concern out of, as we mentioned earlier, the concern about repetitive shutdowns, the continual kind of bashing over the last 30 or 40 years of government employment and employees is that young people will decide that, especially with government at loggerheads over the last several years, well, the government really is hamstrung. And if I want to make a difference, I ought to go into the private sector, or I ought to go into philanthropy, or go work for a billionaire. And so I think that's a risk. Fortunately, and there are a lot of young people here, young people tend to be optimistic and energetic and enthusiastic and sometimes don't know about all those problems. And so my experience at the IRS, where we didn't hire people, that's where we were shrinking, but every once in a while we would have an opening or we'd hire people, and we had a lot of people applying to work for the IRS, not the world's most popular agency. And I think part of it was commitments to public service, recognition of the importance the agency does. But I think to combat that, and Max is here as one of my heroes in the Partnership for Public Service, what we have to do is not only remind people of the important programs and work that the government does, we have to remind you of the great accomplishments individual government employees make. The Partnership for Public Service has its Sammy Awards that highlight a whole series of accomplishments, but have half a dozen stunning achievements by career employees, whether it's in NASA, whether it's in drug research, whether it's in emergency responsiveness. And it's important to honor those people, but those are role models and they are inspirations, not only to other federal employees, but they're role models and inspirations to young people and people thinking about going to the government. So as you all know, in the public arena, good news is not news. It's only when things have fallen off the table, people care a lot about it. So you're pushing on a string to some extent, and Max can describe that better than I can, trying to get people to pay attention to the great work that's done and the things that go on. But I think everybody needs to spend their time doing that. I was asked, my theory of management has been, if you want to know what's going on in an organization, go out and talk to the people doing the work, the frontline employees. And I did that. I ultimately talked to 22,000 IRS employees in person over the 4 years. And we would have town halls with the employees, and then I'd do a town hall with their managers so the employees could say whatever they wanted to. And then 3 years into it, an employee asked me, well, what are you doing? What are we doing to change the image of the agency? And I said, well, it's a great question. I said, and when you think about it, I understand the problem. When people ask you, where do you work? You say, I work for the government. And then they say, well, where in the government do you work? And you say, I work in the Treasury Department. And then they say, where in the Treasury Department do you work? And you say, well, I work in the IRS. And I said, but if you think about it, everybody's got family, everybody has friends, all of you are participants in organizations in your communities, whether it's the PTA, whether it's your church, whether it's some athletic environment, and all those people know you and like you and think you're a good person. So what I need for you to do is you to be advocates for the IRS as a great agency, a great place to work. I say I'm not saying you should wear an IRS t-shirt to the local grocery store on the weekends and have people grumble at you. But I said what we all have to do is be more outgoing about the importance of the work we do with the people who know us, like us, and trust us. So in some ways, that's my suggestion to Max. We need to take 2 million federal employees and have them all become advocates for the work they do with the people they know. And if you took, I told the IRS, if you took 80,000 people and their family and friends, you got a lot of people. You take 2 million federal employees and look at the ripple effects they could have. And it's not facetious. It is important for everybody who's concerned about this to proselytize, as it were, for the importance of government work and the excitement and the satisfaction that comes from being there, whether it's at the federal level or the state, the county, or the city level. It's a great way to spend your time. As I've said to people, the great thing, and I used to tell IRS employees about the difference in the public and the private sector. In the public sector, when you get up on Monday morning, you don't have to think about or worry about whether it makes a difference. You know what you're doing is important to somebody, and you're going to have an impact over the course of time. And that's a unique source of satisfaction, which is why a lot of very brilliant, bright, enthusiastic, hardworking people stay in the government, notwithstanding everything else. It's because they derive great satisfaction from understanding the importance of the work that they do.
So I think you've just given a task for those 800,000 furloughed workers. They have enough time to spread the word. Great, I think we'll open it for questions. The microphone is back there. And
all right, my rule of life and always is there are no rules. So you can ask any question you like about anything. I used to say, when it was quiet, is how, well, I'll demonstrate my ability not to answer questions. And I used to do that, and there was public. So the next headline was, IRS Commissioner says good at not answering questions. So I then restricted myself.
So John, is this on? Can people hear me? Yeah. Great. So I have a million questions for you, but I want to begin at what's most important to me. And I listened to you here. I've listened to you for years and years, and you are really one of the most extraordinary public servants I've had the pleasure of knowing and watching, and have done such amazing things across the board. The core question for me is, how do we get more people like you to lead in government?
Well, I could repeat what I just said. I think, you know, it's wonderful to have this discussion here in this institution. Public policy schools, universities have a significant role to play in not only explaining why public service is important and good, but opening avenues of communication and pathways. So the discussions that are going to be held tomorrow are critical and important for people to not just be neutral about it, but to actually be affirmative about it. And the Sanford School has always done a great job about that, of encouraging people to, and there are a lot of people around Washington in various government positions who are graduates of this program, but there are graduates of other public policy schools as well. And so I do think, again, none of this will, like everything, nothing will happen by accident. As I used to say when I talk to people about management, you know, organization charts don't self-execute. It takes people. Well, we're not going to get people and good people into public service if we just hope it happens, if we kind of wait to see what happens. And so I think, but again, back to my point is, I do think that educational institutions generally, counseling groups, but certainly public policy schools have a major, important, and significant role to play to make sure that not only people want to do it, but that we increase the ability of their ability to do it. We help them with internships. We help them find positions that would be a good fit for them. And thank you for the comments.
Right. Is this, yeah, terrific. Okay. Hi, my name is Chris Stoneman. I'm a 1990 graduate of the Sanford School. It wasn't the Sanford School then, and I can't recall what its name was. But in any case, I've been at EPA. I'm one of the dedicated federal employees who stuck with it for 29 years almost. So my question actually doesn't relate to EPA per se, but you had mentioned or perhaps you did, that you're from Ashland, Kentucky originally. Right. And if I'm not mistaken, that's coal country. And I'm wondering to what degree and how, being from a rural area, I suspect, and from a conservative state and from coal country, how has that impacted, or how did that impact your perspective and your career, if at all?
Well, one thing that's interesting, when I grew up in the 50s, I was born in Cleveland and lived there for 12 years, so I've been rooting for Cleveland athletic teams, which has been a thankless task for the bulk of that time. Moved to Kentucky when I was 12. At that point, there were 2 oil refineries. Ashland's on the Ohio River next to Huntington, about 120 miles east of Cincinnati. And it's rural. You go 50 miles south, you're in the heart of Appalachia, but this was industrialized. So there are 2 oil refineries, 3 or 4 chemical plants on the river, and an open hearth rolling mill. If you lived on that side of town, every 3 years, you either had to get your car painted or get a new one. No one in those days asked, if it's doing that to the car, what's it doing to me? So my classmates, the vast majority had been born there, lived there, and most of them stayed there. So when EPA put out the first 10 major environmental risk areas, Huntington Ashland was one of the 10. My class has had, by the time in my 25th reunion, probably a quarter of the class had died. And if you ever wanted to do an epidemiological study of the impact of clean air and clean water, or dirty air and dirty water, you'd just track my classmates. And the bulk of them died from cancer, breathing all that stuff over time. So one thing that you got out of watching that was a great appreciation of all the work that's been done to clean up the air and clean up the water as it goes forward. But actually, it did also, I gave a talk at a high school graduation recently there, and I left Ashland, came to Duke. I didn't know anybody outside of Ashland. And when I left Duke, I didn't know anybody outside of Duke. So my message to the graduating seniors about 5 years ago at Ashland was that they ought to take leaps of faith, that life was not just dependent upon connections. You didn't have to be well-born, or you didn't have to have a whole infrastructure that was going to make life easy for you. If you were energetic and enthusiastic and worked hard, there was no limit to what you could do. And so, it was a great town to grow up in, 32,000 people. Everybody went to the same high school, so I had a good friend of mine who was either going to become a criminal or a police officer, and he opted to become a police officer. But it was for me, it was a great place to grow up. And I did somehow end up with this drive to be engaged in public service. I was one of those kids, 8-year-old in the 3rd grade, that thought being president would be a lot of fun. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, good evening. My name is Paul Cruz. I'm the director for the Durham VA healthcare system across the street. And one of the persons that's lucky to be an employee that's still getting paid. And to that point, I just want to ask you your opinion or thought about why couldn't the federal government look at their agencies and do that like they've done for the Department of Veteran Affairs, which is a 2-year appropriation, so that stagger those so that we don't run into this situation? Your thoughts? It's
a good question, and there's been some discussion about it kind of on the periphery. And I think it is important because some time ago, the fiscal year for the government used to be June 30th, and the budget always sort of got passed in September. So the thought was, okay, we'll move the fiscal year to September, and that'll solve the problem. And it turned out that wasn't the solution. So the problem and now regularly for the last 15 years anyway, the budgets are always stuck, and then you have continuing resolutions. And the problem with a continuing resolution, especially if you get a cut, as the IRS did, you're running at one level and suddenly you're down. Or if you're going to get an increase, you can't spend that money until you have it. Now you've got 7 or 8 months instead of 12 to figure out how to do it efficiently. So I think probably we've demonstrated, certainly over the last 15 to 20 years, that an annual budgeting process just can't get the job done. And while congressmen love to tug and haul and pick at and have leverage around particular programs, they could do that every 2 years. And at least at a minimum, if you did a 2-year budget, it would still start 3 years into the 2 years. I mean, you can't assume it's going to magically get done on time, but at least then the agencies would be able to program and plan for the money over the last year and a half of that rather than the last 6 to 8 months of it. And it would be much more efficient and effective, and you would have, I think, better results rather than the situation now where EPA and everybody knows you're sitting there trying to figure out, well, how much money do we really have to spend? And is that program expanding, shrinking, or going to stay the same? And that's just, again, when you look at it, it's not a political issue. It's just an inefficient, ineffective way to run an organization.
Good evening. I'm David Singleton. I'm Duke's tax attorney. Been here about 32 years. I've got a comment, a story, and then finally a question for you. The comment is, as I just said, been a tax attorney here for 32 years. Prior to that with a private company for 10, so 42 years of dealing with the IRS. I've never had a problem with any. They've always been first-rate, decent folks that were willing to help, so thanks for your service.
Are we getting that on tape that we could actually?
I hope so. My story is this. I'll take you back to the Allen Building boardroom where I think you were the chair and officers were giving presentations. Jack Adcock was called by you, again, I think by you, to the podium to provide the financial presentation, and he began gathering up a mountain of paperwork. And there was some grumbling around the room a little bit, and as Jack walked up to the podium, it was, I see you all looking at your watches, don't worry, don't worry. And my question is this. I think it was you that said, we're not looking at our watches, Jack, we're looking at our calendars. Is that right? Do you remember that story? Is that right?
Well, it's even more interesting than that.
Okay.
In those days, at that time I was the chairman of the Business and Finance Committee. I was a trustee from 85 to 97. So within a year or two, because I had been working in the private, somehow I became the chairman of the Business and Finance. And the process up till then was people would come, and these are complicated situations. You'd get these materials, but then people would come and go through the materials. So the meeting would be 90% presentation and maybe 5 or 10%. So I sat through a meeting or two and then said, the rule of the game is, and I've done that at the IRS and others, where the IRS had the same process. People would come to the commissioner's office and send materials and then go through them. And so at the IRS and at the Business and Finance Committee 30 years ago, I said, the rule of this is everybody's going to be assumed to have read the materials. So when Jack comes in or Ralph Schneider for the health system comes in, they can give 5 minutes if they'd like, but then we're going to spend time discussing what's in the materials. And anybody who hasn't taken the time to read the materials is going to be in the dark, but we're not going to actually spend the time at show and tell. And the meetings got to be much more interesting, and I think much more productive for the presenters, because then they got feedback from the materials and the discussions that they wanted to have, as opposed to simply repeating what was in the materials. And that certainly was the case at the IRS. I would have people come in, and actually the game turned out to be, I met every month with the division head of all of the various divisions, and I told them again, the rules was usually they would come in and meeting the commissioner was some secret society, and I said, no, bring whoever you would like. So to get to see the commissioner, people thought that was great, so I would have 6 or 8 of the senior people in wage and investment or large business. And so the game got to be, after a while, whether people could anticipate the questions I was going to ask based on the materials they had provided. And they were always frustrated that they could never quite anticipate all the questions as we went forward. But I did think it was critical across the board for meetings for people to read the materials. People take a lot of time to prepare them, to read them and understand. And the purpose of the meeting ought to be to actually discuss them and try to figure out what the answer to the problems are, rather than just listening to the meeting. Now, wasn't true at Duke, but and this goes on in private sector companies. I've been in board meetings there too, where I've had the same rules. The theory a lot of people have is, but that's the way to keep them out of your hair. If you're the CEO and you got the board and they're coming, if you give them all the material, but then you come in and you make a long presentation. When I was at Freddie Mac, that was the idea. But then the board meeting's over, and maybe they ask a couple questions, and you go back and run the business. And you don't have to worry about what they got to say. But if you're going to do that, you might as well not have the board. And so the goal is to actually not have them run the business, which sometimes they get something to do, but to actually get the benefit of their perspectives and their background and their experience, and have a real discussion about what the challenges are and the problems are.
John, I also want to thank you for your service. I mean, you've played such an amazing range of roles throughout your career in public service, and it's really been extraordinary. And it was great to hear the inside baseball of the Y2K, all the planning and stuff. But I think we all sort of need like a video screen up there with all the headlines of the day that were scaring, the daylights out of everybody. Some of it was exaggerated, but it was a real, and you made it sound like it was, oh, well, of course we saw this, we did A, B, C, and D, and it was an extraordinary achievement that you and your colleagues, made at the time. was working with Vice President Gore then, and I remember helping him write the foreign policy section of his announcement speech for running for president. And he would say, foreign policy doesn't matter that much anyway, but nothing matters if they screw up Y2K, right? Because it's all connected to me. So it was really one of those amazing achievements. But the question I want to ask you is about, flexibility, greater flexibility for people that want to go in to public sector careers. We see in our students, that people don't think of careers the way other generations did. They may find an area of policy they're interested in, and over the course of the career go from the public sector to the private sector to the nonprofit sector. And you can go in through Schedule Cs, but that's more political. But how do we try to build in more flexibility so that if you see somebody who's really talented out there, you can bring them in, and I know Max is working on this, and it's hard, I know, at the State Department elsewhere, but isn't that a sense that we can draw in people, then they also get that experience and they can take it back to the private or nonprofit sector and help with their own relationships with government? Are there real ideas or strategies to try to build that in a little bit more to opportunities?
Well, it's the critical question that faces everybody running anything in the federal government, and that is a difference. I guess I could have said that difference in the private and the public sector. Everybody worries in the public sector about firing people. I said, that's not the problem. The real problem is hiring people and going through the process. And the IRS got to be very efficient, but it still took 60 to 90 days to get somebody through. The Treasury people finally did a meeting with us to figure out how come we were faster than they were, but even at that speed it was too slow. We had a special authority that then the Freedom Caucus got rid of for a number of years for information technology, strategic hiring authority that allowed us to hire people directly in IT for security and other purposes, and with a higher pay range. And that worked for about 15 years, because again, in technology especially, if you've got somebody good at cybersecurity or program, whatever it is, and they're interested in coming, the IRS or somebody, EPA, and you tell them, okay, you're terrific. Now, if you just sit there for 3 to 6 months, we can get you in. And the competition is saying, you're terrific and start next Monday or start in a month. You're going to lose all those people. So it's a system designed, obviously, to deal with the spoil system from 100 years ago when everybody got hired into the government as a political appointee. And we ought to make sure that people are qualified and we're not staffing the place with people who don't work well. But it really is a classic system designed to not make a mistake, and therefore makes it impossible to run efficiently. And my sense is we'd do a lot better to run the system and recognize maybe we'll make a mistake or two. I used to try to get the Congress to understand when they were putting all these constraints. I say, if you run the system to catch the 1 or 2% of people who are a problem, you just screw it up with the other 98%. And that's really what we're doing in the hiring. We're trying to make it foolproof so that we never hire anybody who's not totally qualified for this position, who doesn't know anybody in the government. And I would rather take my chances with direct hire. And the IRS experience, there are other places, a couple, not many, of that hiring, it never was a problem. And because people are on probation, if you made a mistake, you had a year to find that mistake out and resolve it. But that program ran, they never had the ability to hire more than 40 people, and actually never used it for more than 32 at a time. But something like that, it's not a question of tweaking, okay, the forms, we got to make them shorter or something. You've got to be able to trust that the system will work with basic fundamental strictures and that you'll catch the problems. The IGs are out there trying to figure out what's going on, and people complain. And employees know. I've said in any organization, and an athletic team, you ask the players, they can tell you who the good players are and who the ones who are not good. You ask employees who are the productive and non-productive people, everybody knows that. So if you've hired people, it's not rocket science to figure out who's not the right person. But I can guarantee you that's going to be 1% of the situation. And we do just a whole lot better to try to make it easier for the 99%.
Could I do a brief follow-up to that?
You certainly can.
To expand on this. So I have a friend who spent many years as a reporter, and the last few years of his career as a government spokesperson for a federal agency. And he said his takeaway from that is that every reporter should have to spend 1 year in government. Just 1 year. And I wonder if there could be a system set up, extrapolating from that, not just to reporters, where private sector people, nonprofit people could be detailed to government for a year, just to understand it better, and if that might also have the advantage of addressing the government's image problem to the extent it has one as well.
Well, that's right. I mean, a long time ago, it was hard for private sector people to figure out how to get into the government because they were management people, finance people, and then over time, important positions have been created. So they're now chief financial officers, they're chief information officers, they're chief, basically the theory of Vice President Gore was to take the deputy secretaries and make them the chief operating officers. I chaired the President's Management Council of all those people, and I kidded that a lot of them had never met a chief operating officer up close and personal, but now they were one. Now there are a lot more places where you can tap into the expertise of the private sector. And so there are some cases where there have been details there's always nervousness about, will that somehow create paths of communication back and forth that will bias the process. But I do think it's right that it wouldn't take people long if you worked in any federal agency to discover the place is full of hard-working, dedicated, really smart, capable people. And it would help, defeat that image of, well, these are just brown bag people, show up at 9 and go home at 5 and, take a long lunch hour. But notwithstanding all those problems, as I say, my experience has been that, and I ran the city of Washington, which had been undermanaged for 20 years by Marion Barry before we got there. Even then, there were just wonderful people working in the government. And so we need to fix those problems. We may need to make it more attractive. We need to make it easier. But as we do that, we need to continue to recognize that that's not saying that the people who are there now wouldn't be there if we just had better processes or better understanding about it.
Thank you.
John, I'm Bill Adair. I'm the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, which is our journalism program here at Sanford. Sort of a perfect follow-up to what you're talking about, and Kristin's question is, to the extent that there's misunderstanding that might be passed along by my fellow journalists, I think sometimes it's because we have difficulty getting access to government officials. And it's something you and I have talked about, and something I always appreciated about you as IRS commissioner, that you were pretty open with the press. And I wonder sort of what your philosophy was and how we can spread that philosophy to more people in government, because too often the response is not to talk to the media, to only communicate by email. And I just think if we're going to build understanding, you need to talk to reporters.
Yeah, the proof of the pudding is I now continue to get calls, especially during the shutdown. People have discovered I ran the other ones, but a lot of the issues are around the IRS. So I continue to get calls from the Wall Street Journal, the Times, and the Post because they can't get information from anybody else. So I thought, well, okay. The point is critical, and it's an education point. As I tell people, I understand why particularly government officials but private sector people too, are uneasy about talking to the press because they're concerned about they'll get misquoted or the story won't be right. And particularly when I was running the city, and the city of Washington is the most difficult city to run in the country, not because of its size, but because it's a state and a county and a city all rolled up. So instead of 8 or 10 departments, we had 25, the motor vehicles department, mental health department, Medicaid department, more ways for people to get into mischief. And it was shut down, and everybody, the Post at that time, it's unfortunate, the Post at that time had 4 people working full-time covering the city. And as I said, they were all anxious for the Pulitzer Prize, generally not given for good news. So they were all out. But I thought it was important, and it's a great loss that the Post doesn't have that anymore and can't afford it, because that was a great check on the government. But I tried to get all the agency heads to understand. Serge Kovaleski, who the president was attacking because of his physical challenges, had come from New York and was now working for the Post, an aggressive, hard-nosed, investigative reporter. And I tried to get everybody to understand, if you don't talk to Serge, then you can't be surprised when your side of the story is not in his story. And you got to recognize within a reporter, if you don't talk to them, you're just making their job more difficult. So you shouldn't be surprised if they're not really happy about you. And I said, and Serge was a great example. I said, if you talk to Serge, you're not necessarily going to convince him not to write his story, But I can guarantee you your position will be in the story, your answer to it, and that's all you can expect and ask for. But if you don't talk to him, he's never going to know what the issue is. And it's the IRS was famous that way. The predecessor was famous for not talking to anybody. And a Fox News reporter, a young guy, his bit was to chase the IRS commissioner out with his camera and his microphone as he got into the car, not responding. So before my first hearing, the communications director of the IRS told him, he said, you know, you're not going to be able to chase the commissioner after the hearing. And he was, well, why not? And he said, because he's actually going to do a press conference after the hearing. And the result was that Fox News there were 3 or 4 reporters in there, Fox News ran that response to all those questions totally without any commentary, and this was a contentious hearing, full scale, saying this is the first time we've had this is the first national interview with the IRS commissioner. Now that was the only nice thing Fox News ever did for me in the 4 years. But it goes to, and again, it's education, and we actually, in the Clinton administration, ran with the vice president 3 or 4 years in, a session for new political appointees. And one of the issues we tried to get across was you have to talk to the press. You have to try to see it from their side of the story, and you have to get your side of the story out. Otherwise, you're just going to get killed, and it doesn't work perfectly. The headline writers are different than the reporters, so the headline will be, IRS commissioner says good at not answering questions. The pictures may not always be. The Post, while I was the city administrator, had what I call the snapping turtle picture. It looked like I was, and I kept thinking, I told them, I said, could you get another picture? I mean, even if it's a bad article. But it's a training issue, it's a discussion issue, but I know the problem, and I watch it happen across the board of people just, being uncommunicative, and an entire agency not commenting. And it just seems to me, again, it's the other side of the coin. It helps destroy or undercut the credibility of government if people sense that it's this black box and you can't find out what's going on in it, and it's not transparent and it's not responsive. Then, it's not surprising for people to say, I don't know what they're doing in there, but it can't be good if they won't talk about it. It was, again, back to the problem of panic for Y2K. What I was trying to get the industry groups to understand was if you didn't tell anybody what you were doing, they were going to assume the worst, because all these people were talking about the world come to an end. If you just stood up and said, we're working on it, we're 30% done, we'll let you know when we get done, it'll help alleviate that problem significantly. So one of the things we ought to be doing as we're training young people to go into government and into public service is to train them to be comfortable dealing with the press and answering questions. It's like here, my rule of thumb has always been there are no rules. You can ask me any question you want about anything, whether you're an employee or a member of the press. And I have a rule, I never talk off the record, because my sense is if you do that, reporter always wonders, I wonder if what he would tell me if he was really going to tell me the full story. So my view with the reporters is I'll tell you what I can tell you. If I can't tell you or I don't want to tell you, I'll tell you that. But you'll know what you don't know. It won't be a guessing game of, well, I wonder what he's got up his sleeve.
Thank you very much.
You said I could ask you anything you wanted. I wanted to know here.
Where are we? There you are.
Yes. Just having read one of many books, the latest one is Democracy in Chains, about prominent people who don't want government. It's very distressing, and I really would like to know are you distressed? I mean, it's hard for me to sleep at night sometime after reading these books, and I would like your comments.
Well, it goes back to whether people really understand what the implications are of their positions. There were some people happy to underfund the IRS on the ground that the government would have less revenue and then it could get into less mischief and the deficit would get bigger and that would stop the governments in its track. There was a theory when Reagan was president that was his theory, was you would in effect bankrupt the government, and that was a great way to constrain it. And so I think it is important for it to be discussed, for it to be a dialogue. Part of what we're missing today is people able to talk with each other. One of my goals was I wanted to go to a Tea Party convention and talk about what the IRS was doing or not doing. My security team blanched at the idea that I would go to an audience of 2,000 people who didn't like me and start talking to them. But I do think you have to reach across those barriers and those boundaries, and when people have views, try to figure out where they're coming from and have a discussion about it and an explanation about it and an education about it. You know, we basically, the real risk is everybody's retreating to their own corner, lobbing grenades at each other. And you know, part of, you know, it was interesting, I saw an article at some point recently that said, you know, the founders were comfortable that the extremists were not really a major threat because they couldn't find each other. You know, they would never, with a critical mass, get together. So one of the phenomena we have now with social media is the positive thing is you can raise a lot of money, you could get people to, you know, work together, you can communicate a lot of positive ideas. You also allow people with extreme views or even just very complicated views to find adherents and discover, hey, there are a lot of us out here, because it may only be 2% or 5% of the population, but that's a lot of people. And so people have, you know, it just keeps dividing up in a way that's troubling. And, you know, the media, you can see the phenomenon. In the old days, everybody listened to Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley, and you got the news for half an hour, and everybody got the same news, so it was kind of fit. And then you went about your life. And then the cable fractionation of the audience came along, and suddenly sports channels as well as news channels had 24 hours to fill, and then they were competing for audiences. So the logical thing to do is, well, let's find my audience. And so you could over time watch it all fractionate. And you know, I have a brother who thinks that the only true news is on Fox News, and I have other friends who think the only thing you should listen to is MSNBC. And so, you know, it's a fundamental social problem we've got, is that how do you bridge the gaps, and how do you actually not look at people as the deplorables? How do you not actually, it goes a good question about coming up from in a small town, rural area, coal area near Appalachia. You know, you have to have people appreciate people from all walks of life. And there's a risk that, I've always said that sometimes I'm, you know, kind of a free marketeer. I'm obviously a Democrat and liberal, but I've said, you know, there's a tendency for government programs to assume, it's a little like hiring people, that you can't trust people. So you have to make decisions for them. So we used to give people food, you know, the agricultural surplus program. That way we knew they'd have food. And then, well, okay, maybe we aren't going to give them food, but if we're going to give them financial support, we'll make it food stamps, because then we'll know you're buying food and you're not drinking, because the assumption everybody will be an alcoholic. And so we create a lot of constraints built around lack of understanding that most people are fairly rational, and there aren't more alcoholics in low-income people than there are in wealthy areas. And so just the lack of communication and understanding gets more troubling with time. And the only answer to that is for more people to be concerned about it and try to bridge those gaps.
So we have 3 minutes left, so time for one quick question.
Thank you for being with us today, John. I'm Bill Eco, visiting professor of the practice here at Sanford, and I just have a quick question about numbers. I believe, and Max can correct me if I'm wrong, but that the federal government is overseen by about 4,000 political appointees, and about 1,200 out of the 4,000 are confirmed by the Senate. Is that about right? Okay. So is that about right, or should there be, is that too many? I mean, should there be more career people executing, you know, running these agencies, et cetera, or do we have it about right, where across the top of every agency there's a whole cadre of political, non-career people?
It's a good question, one that a lot of us have been troubled about for some time. It's far too many. Problem with the 1,200 Senate confirmations is it's almost impossible for the Senate efficiently to confirm 1,200 people as you go forward. And yeah, the advantage of the IRS, everybody asked me at the transition from Obama to Trump, what was it like? I said, well, I'm the only political appointee, and tax season is not political, and we're going to run the tax season. So for us, the transition was pretty simple. For most agencies with 4 or 5 layers of political appointees, you have to wait till they show up to find out where they want to go. And career people are sensitive to, you know, trying to do their job, but trying to make sure they're on the right page, going in the right direction. So if those 5 layers don't show up for 6 to 12 months, you've sort of hamstrung the place while everybody's waiting. I mean, and then the confirmation process has its own problem. There's a very good guy nominated for the other political position at the IRS, chief counsel, an important position. He's terrific. He's being held up over some irrelevant argument by a Menendez out of New Jersey. And so he's been sitting around for 6 to 8 months. Why he sits around for 6 to 8 months, I don't know. So you'd do much better to have the confirmation process be for the things that count. The secretary, the deputy secretary, maybe the general counsel. And then you had to figure out how many layers of political appointees do you have. There's this theory, that's the deep state theory, that, well, I got to have layers of people because you can't trust the career people. They got their own agendas. I got to tell you, my experience, and from OMB and dealing with the entire government and worrying about its management and other places, is the career people are terrific and anxious to move in the direction that the agency is being led. So this idea that, now to some extent, to the extent AP is a great example, you put people at the top who are trying to get rid of the agency, that gets to be a little more problematic. But as a general matter, this idea that I need 5 layers of political people to keep an eye on everybody, you know, it turns out to be a waste of time as well. So you've got, and it's not a question of control or not control. What people don't understand is, you know, I'm a manager and I spent my career doing that, is it just makes it impossible to run the place very efficiently. You're waiting all this time for the politicals, then some of them are truly political, don't know anything about what's going on, so you got to educate and train them as you go. And then comes another transition, and first of all, they then leave. The average half-life is somewhere around 20 to 22, 24 months. Then there's another gap, and then another group of people come in. And so if you say, is that a good way to run the operation? You'd say, that doesn't make any sense at all. It'd be one thing if the secretary leaves or the deputy, but if you've got 5 layers and they're all moving at different times, it's very tough for career people to figure out who's on first and where do they want to go differently. We got these issues. So the fact that the place runs and the agencies continue to make progress is the greatest tribute to career employees that you could demonstrate, because the process is almost irrational.
On that positive note, we want to thank you very much.